to move into round two. Remember how you voted in the beginning. We're going to move into round two, in which the debaters address one another directly. They will be taking questions from me and then questions from you in the audience. So I just want to state where we are. This is an Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan of ABC News. We have two teams of debaters arguing out this motion. Islam is a religion of peace. The side arguing for the motion, Zeba Khan and Majid Nawaz, have been make the argument that the extremists do not define Islam. Take away the extremists and you have a religion of peace. The side arguing against, Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray, argue it's not about extremists, it's inherent. It's inherent in the tradition, it's inherent in the scripture, and it's inherent in the history. And to the question of the notion, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, of this not just being about extremists, you concede that there are extremists, but that's, you say, not the problem. What about your opponents? What about your parents? What about Muslims you know who do not adhere to a violent form of religion? Are they, if there's something about the faith themselves, are they embracing spiritually something that is morally an illusion?
Well, my parents and people like my respectful opponents here are ignoring the basic tenets of their religion. When Muhammad, the founder of the religion, called out to all Muslims, and that's how he won most of his wars, by saying, I have been ordered, and all believing men have been ordered to attack and kill and maim anyone unless they testify, unless all men testify to the fact that Allah is the one and only, Muhammad is his messenger. My father disobeys that. Majid Nawaz tried to obey that first and then stopped obeying it. But the fact that that scripture is there and that history of militarism is there belies the notion that Islam is a religion of peace. The point I want to make is Islam is a religion, when you take the scripture, that can be employed to wage war, and Islam as a civilization has known periods of peace. But you cannot, if you pay attention to that history, pay attention to the evidence, continue to say that Islam is a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is only a religion of war. It is both. But in Islam, and that's why we are debating it in the 21st century, there are more occurrences of violence and war and strife and subjection of women than there are in other religions. And my point, our point is, let's not deny it, because by denying it we don't solve the problem. Let's admit it, and then as intelligent people take it from there. What is to blame on external factors? What is to blame on the inside?
Majid Nawaz, who was an extremist, now an anti-extremist. Majid, respond.
So, forgive me for the assumption, Ayaan. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you, by the way, but forgive me for the assumption, but do you speak Arabic? Have you studied Arabic grammar? And I'm asking for a purpose which, if you do give me the chance to explain, I will. But first of all, just let me ask you that question.
I don't speak it as well as you do. And I want to know where the question is going before I give a full answer to that. If you want me to quote the Quran, I will.
You may be surprised that I don't know if I speak well or not, but the reason I'm asking is that you just quoted a hadith of the Prophet, and you actually really did exaggerate what he said. And I'll quote to you the exact hadith in Arabic and then translate it. Now, what you quoted was... well, the hadith is أمرت أن أقاتل الناس حتى أمرت أن أقاتل الناس حتى يشهدوا أن لا إله إلا الله. Now, what you quoted in the translation was kill and maim, and you went on and explained. Now, actually, أقاتل means to fight. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good hadith. What I'm saying is when we're translating, let's try and be accurate. And that brings me to the point. And that is that I've just thought of a word to describe this, and it's just come to me, so thank you, because I'm going to use it forever onwards. And that word is suspended intelligence. There's a tendency when discussing Islam to suspend the tools that we have learnt and studied, that you have studied as well, that we use to analyze every other piece of scripture and literature in the world. And that is that we recognize that texts do not speak for themselves. We recognize that when we interpret scriptures and texts and books and poetry, that they are contextualized, that we have methodologies to approach them. When we're reading Shakespeare, when we're reading anything, we recognize that there's a way to interpret text, and there are schools of thought and differences over how to approach texts. Now, if we contextualize Martin Luther and say the Reformation was a good thing, despite the fact that he said, kill and slay the peasants, wherever you find them, when they followed Thomas Muntzer, when he was calling for not just breaking away from the papal authority, but also for rebelling against the monarchies and the dictators that they found themselves in. Martin Luther sided with the tyrants against Muntzer and said, kill the peasants wherever you find them. Despite that, I'm prepared to say the Reformation was a good thing. And the reason I'm prepared to say that is that Martin Luther must not be judged by the standards of civilization that we, after an accumulation of thousands of years, have arrived at. He must be judged by the standards of civilization that were around during his time. And that's how society evolves. And we recognize that for every other faith and for every other piece of literature, yet when it comes to Islam, somehow we want to suspend
Douglas Murray.
what we've learnt about that and quote verbatim from
Majid.
texts.
Yes, we read things in their context. I mean, you read Chaucer in context. Chaucer doesn't have followers. He doesn't have 1.4 billion people who believe every...
Sorry, I quoted
or
Martin Luther,
believe,
not Chaucer.
Or are meant to believe everything that
I
says...
suppose Martin Luther does have followers.
If you allowed me to speak, I'd address your Luther point.
Yeah.
I'll get there, I promise.
Right.
You don't have followers of Shakespeare who insist on, or are meant to insist on line by line following everything Shakespeare did and believing everything he wrote. That's because it's literature. Actually, what's happening, Majid, is you've put your finger on the problem.
Absolutely.
It's not us that isn't applying the rigorous critical faculties. We're applying them to the Quran as we would to any other work of literature. You're not, because you can't. And the final thing on that,
what do you mean he can't? What do you mean that he can't?
Well, because Majid knows very well that
Majid
if
is
he's...
a believer.
that
And
if he's
believers are not allowed to contextualize the
Sorry,
text.
Is that
can
true?
I bring you back to my question? What about Martin
is
Luther?
that
Because
really true?
if you were
if the
allowed
point-
to
just a moment,
contextualize, you would say some of the things that
Right.
Muhammad did is crap.
If
You would say some of
Yeah.
the
Majid, is it
things
true
was
that you
great.
cannot-
So
you
you
cannot-
contextualize.
Is that true?
No, it's not true. Now, can I say...
What do you
that
think of
as
Muhammad
many-
taking a 6-year-old as a bride? What do you think of that?
I don't think that's a particularly good idea. However, what I would say is that
Glad to hear it.
there are many, many people
We are
in
progressing.
history that have done such a thing. And what we're talking about here is the failure to contextualize actions for the standards of their time. And I'll come back to the point I made, because, Douglas, you didn't address it despite your
about
protestations
to
that you
do
were
so.
going to. Now, let me just ask you again. Martin Luther was a fundamentalist,
Yes.
wasn't he?
Absolutely.
All Christians will
let
agree
me-
with you that he was
Right.
a fundamentalist.
Can I now answer Majid's
Please.
question?
Yes.
And then I want to bring in
Okay.
Zeba.
If there were currently Lutherans, there are Lutherans around. You meet them occasionally in Scandinavia and so on. Very nice, very nice it is, and peaceable guys they are by and large. If, however, there was a large proportion of Lutherans somewhere in Scandinavia that started blowing up non-Lutherans, or no, sorry, let's be absolutely right, started massacring peasants. Do you think that people would say, hang on a minute, let's not criticise Martin Luther, he did that by the standards of his time, we shouldn't criticise his followers all that much, and we shouldn't point out what he said and so on. No, we just say, you know, don't go and massacre peasants. Full stop. It was rubbish at
Douglas,
the
you're
time, it's
missing the
rubbish
point.
now. It's the same with
You're
the Quran.
missing the point. If you're failing to judge...
Now, let me bring in your partner. Zeba Khan.
I just wanted to point out in terms of when we're talking about the Quran and saying that we can't contextualize it, that's simply not true. That is a debate that's hot in the community amongst Muslim scholars and amongst Muslims themselves. We're debating that very question. Is the Quran a living document? Much like it's similar in comparison to, say, the Constitution and the debates that happen around that. Around that. The fact is, scholars say that, you know, when you look at the Quranic Arabic, there can be, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interpretations for every word. There's only certain things in the Quran that scholars agree are concrete, like the concept of God, afterlife, things like that. But beyond that, there is a wide range of interpretation, which is why there is a history that not many people look at, and that's part of the problem, that nobody's actually looked at the history of debate within Islam about every sort of aspect that can come to mind.
I disagree with that. The reason why I disagree with it, it would be more accurate, Ziba, if you said the scholars that you find attractive say that. But there are a bunch of scholars with a great number of following in Islam, all of them are self-appointed, by the way, because there's no hierarchy, there's no seminary of Islam, except a University of Al-Azhar, and we know the products of Al-Azhar. But there are scholars like Bin Laden who say we have to take
He's not a scholar
the Quran.
by anyone's
Well, he
measure.
has the greatest following. He has
That's
the
not
greatest
true.
following. The Islamic Brotherhood,
It's
Hassan
really not
al-Banna. When you look at the Sunni Islam, when you look at Ayatollah Khomeini in the 20th century, the most influential guy of Shia Islam, another self-appointed scholar, you have all of Sheikh bin Baz. He has the greatest following. Sheikh al-Qaradawi. Maybe these are individuals that are not attractive to you, but then it would be more accurate if you stated that. They are attractive to many Muslims, not thousands, but in the millions. And what they say, and that's why they're influential, is they challenge every single Muslim individual. Are you a true Muslim? If you are a true Muslim, you live by what the Quran dictates, you follow the example of the Prophet
Right,
Muhammad.
their interpretation,
and those
though.
scholars who insist on that are far more influential, far more powerful
So,
than you
Ayan, you just
soft-spoken,
quoted-
wonderful, cuddly scholars.
Well,
Majid Nawaz.
so Ayan, you just quoted Bin Laden as a scholar and Hassan al-Banna as a scholar. Bin Laden, for those of you who don't know, is an engineer, a qualified engineer. So don't know him.
Why
Someone
don't
was
you
loving-
define who is a scholar?
Don't know his history. He's a qualified engineer who comes from one of the richest construction families in Saudi Arabia and was educated in the elite private schools of Switzerland and Saudi Arabia. Hassan al-Banna that you referred to was a school teacher. And in fact, what you find common with all of the movements that you're worried about and that I'm worried about and we're all worried about are that they are founded by people who do not have a theological background. Now, for all we think of Al-Azhar and their very conservative views,
Sheikh
what
bin
we don't
Baz.
find is that Al-Azhar produces the likes of Bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna, or even Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Maududi was a journalist.
Sayyid
Qutb, the founder of modern-day jihadism, was a literary critic who came to America on a scholarship in the 1950s to study literature. He was not a theologian. So coming back to the point,
Why don't you
please,
name a
Ayan,
number
don't
of scholars
define
who are
for
influential,
the
who are
whole
not?
world who a Muslim scholar is. Because actually the people you refer to were not qualified theologians.
But don't you touch on the problem by admitting this? Don't you touch on the problem that is inherent in Islam after the death of Muhammad? That the problem of who speaks for Islam has not been resolved. It could be the two of you,
Yeah, but what's
it
that
could
got
be
to do
Bin
with Islam
Laden,
being a
it
religion of
could be
peace?
Al-Qaradawi, it could be Faisal Shahzad,
I-
it could
I-
be
I-
me.
Faisal
I-
Shahzad
I
is
wanna
not
go
an
directly-
engineer. Sorry,
Ayan,
nothing against
the
engineers in the
question
crowd.
he just
Please
asked,
vote for
what
us,
does
but
that have to
seriously.
do with Islam being a religion of peace? If you're almost making the argument that Islam is what you want it to be, depending on how you behave. So if you behave peacefully, is it not a religion of peace to you?
That is a brilliant question. When you can start by saying Islam is something to a different thing to 1.57 billion people. And from that general point, you can reduce it to what is it that unifies them. And ultimately, you will get to the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, the Hadith, the Day of Judgment. The belief in the Day of Judgment. And if you take those three concepts, then it's far from a religion of peace. Because you look, first of all, not only at the content of the Quran, in context, fine, I'm willing to contextualize it, but what if other believers are not and they're influential? What if I want to read Muhammad's practices simply as a matter of history, another great figure in history, but more Muslims, millions of Muslims don't want to do that
Right,
and
so-
really
so
want to follow
if
his
you're willing
practice.
that you are
What
able to-
if more and more Muslims invest in the hereafter more than they invest in life? Then we have a problem. And that's why I ask you to vote against the motion. It cannot be only a religion of peace. Because if it were
Douglas-
only a religion of peace, if it were perfect, why would we have this debate?
Douglas,
Why would we
given the
be
long
talking about
run that
reforming
Ayan had,
it?
can you be
I'll
15
be
seconds?
extremely
'cause I'm-
succinct, I promise.
yeah.
Majid's trying to imply that the whole extremist problem is a sort of misreading by engineers and literary critics. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case, hasn't been historically in Islam, and isn't now. Ayatollah Khomeini, who Ayan mentioned earlier, was not a self-trained engineer, rich boy like Bin Laden, unfortunately, and managed to hurtle a very developed, distinguished culture back in time in 1979 and hurtled this country back into the state it's currently in under these cloaked dictators. The Grand Mufti of Egypt is
All right,
not
we
a
see where you're
self-taught,
going, and I don't need
yet
a list.
he taught
Let's
people
go
the
back
idea
to
that all
Majid.
Muslims should go and fight the Israelis with
Majid.
Hezbollah.
So, sorry, on Khomeini, I acknowledge Khomeini is a trained theologian, and the fact is he came in the 70s, Douglas, and that proves something. What was he so famous for? Khomeini was recognized for bringing a revolution in Shiite theology. And what was the revolution? Those of you who've studied this will know that the revolution was that up until him, Shiites had been avowedly religiously secular because they believed no one had the right to rule in God's name until the Messiah came, and let them wait for that Messiah until the end of time. Khomeini changed that and turned it on its head. And if that proves something, it proves one thing, and that is it was not consistent with Islamic Shiite tradition. What he did was a very modern revolution, influenced by his studies in Europe and influenced by modern European fascism. He broke from tradition, and that's why it was called a revolution. He was not a continuance of Shiite tradition.
It's the fault of the Europeans, in other words. It's
external. No one's saying
Remember
it's
the victim status.
Seriously,
It's not internal.
Zeba, I want to ask you something about reforms for Islam. Does Islam need reform?
It needs a renaissance. It doesn't need a reform. Reform in the sense, and the reason I say that is because we have to be careful of our terminology. If we say reform as in Reformation, we're thinking of a Christian context, where you had the Protestants and Martin Luther saying, rejecting the Catholicism and the Pope. But the thing is, in Islam, there is no Pope. There is no centralized authority. So there can't be a reformation in that sense. What there needs to be is a return to genuine Islamic principles, which have been not studied, have not been enforced, and are forgotten. So it's not exactly that.
All right.
But a return to genuine Islamic principles is exactly what Al-Qaeda is advocating.
No, that's not actually what they're... No, that's actually incorrect.
A return, a rebirth,
Al-Qaeda, so the difference between Al-Qaeda
is exactly what all those extremist
the radio
organizations
cannot make sense of
are.
two voices, and I'm talking now too at the same time. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to make that point, and then I want to hear back. So think 20 seconds.
When you look at the extremist the organizations that we've come to call extremist, what they're advocating when they answer the question, what went wrong? We had this empire, we lost it. How do we regain it? Their answer is a rebirth. Let's go back to the origins, a revival of it. Is that what you want, Zeba?
No, they actually covert the language for their own political purposes. Al-Qaeda is not calling for a return to Islam or to original Islam or anything like that. They're actually using Islam as a cover for their political grievances. When you look and ask Muslims, ask 1.5 billion Muslims, when you look at the mainstream, they're 90%. They're peaceful and fine. When you look at the politically radicalized, when you ask them, what do they fear most? They say Western domination and occupation. But when you ask mainstream Muslims what they fear, they say economic issues, unemployment. There's a clear difference. And so they are not, what we can determine from that is that it's not religion, because religiosity between the two is indistinguishable. How pious they are, indistinguishable. It's the one factor that makes the difference is what they focus on and their grievances against, perceived grievances against the West.
Douglas Murray.
But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings? Which is as follows, is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, you know, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbour and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of, well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
See, this comes back to what you mean by people going back to the origins, and I refuse, as does Zeba, and as we're asking for all of you to do, is to refuse for Islam to be hijacked and monopolized by the bin Ladens of this world who want to tell you what it means to go back to the original sources. Now, if that was the case, then I ask you, why is it that in Bangladesh, where there was a free and fair election, the Islamist party lost roundly? They completely lost the elections. In Pakistan, where there were recent elections, the Islamist alliance in the north that came to prominence after the occupation of Afghanistan, they completely lost all their seats. So the Muslims in two of the most populous Muslim-majority countries in the world, as is the case in Indonesia, whenever they have a chance to vote, they do not vote for the Islamist extremists. And time again in elections across Muslim-majority states, they have proven that their interpretation of Islam, and they are the majority, is not the interpretation of Douglas, Ayan, and bin Laden. Now, I don't want to be in that camp.
All right. I want to take a little break and